The wagon lurched to a stop in the middle of nowhere, and Caroline felt the cold before she even heard the driver's voice telling her to get out. She pressed one hand against her swollen belly and gripped the wooden bench with the other, her breath fogging in the frigid air as she tried to understand what was happening. "This ain't right," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Silver Creek's supposed to be another 6 miles. The driver wouldn't meet her eyes. He was young, maybe 20, with a patchy beard and hands that shook as he reached for her travel bag. "Got my orders, ma'am. You step down now, or I'll have to leave the bag too." Caroline's chest tightened. She'd paid for passage all the way to Silver Creek, paid with the last of the money her aunt had tucked into her coat before she left St. Louis. The telegram from Samuel Garrett had been clear. He'd meet her at the postal station on the 9th of December. But the driver was already tossing her bag into the snow, and the 2 other passengers, a middle-aged couple wrapped in furs, stared straight ahead like she didn't exist. "Please," Caroline said, hatting the tremble in her voice. "I'm expected. Mr. Garrett's waiting for me." The driver finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face wasn't cruelty exactly, just fear. "Garrett sent word this morning, said he don't want you coming, said there's been a mistake." The words hit her like a slap. Caroline climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking into snow that came up past her ankles. The cold bit through her wool skirt and the thin shawl she'd wrapped twice around her shoulders. She was 4 months along, maybe 5, and the baby's father had been dead since September, shot in a dispute over a card game Caroline hadn't even known he was part of. Samuel Garrett's advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like salvation, a rancher in Montana Territory seeking a sturdy, God-fearing woman to share his life. She'd written back the same day, and his reply had come within 2 weeks. He'd known about the baby. She'd told him in the second letter, her hand shaking so hard she'd had to rewrite it 3 times. He'd said it didn't matter. The wagon pulled away, its wheels cutting dark lines through the snow. Caroline stood there until the sound faded, until there was nothing but wind and the endless white stretching in every direction. The sun was already dropping toward the mountains, painting the sky a bruised purple. She picked up her bag and started walking. Her feet went numb first, then her fingers. She kept her eyes on the horizon, searching for smoke or rooftops or anything that looked like shelter. The road was barely visible under the snow, just a slight depression winding through the valley. She thought about her aunt's kitchen back in St. Louis, the warmth of the stove and the smell of bread baking. She thought about the baby, about how she'd promised it a better life than the one she'd had. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face until she had to stop and turn away from it, gasping. That's when she saw the rider. He was maybe 100 yards off, sitting on a gray horse that stood perfectly still despite the weather. Caroline couldn't make out his face, just the dark shape of him against the white landscape. She raised one arm, waving, but he didn't move. For a long moment they stayed like that, her arm in the air and him watching, and then he turned the horse and started toward her. He didn't speak when he reached her, just looked down from the saddle with eyes so pale they were almost colorless. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. His coat was patched at the shoulders, and he wore no gloves despite the cold. "I'm looking for Silver Creek," Caroline said, forcing the words past her chattering teeth. "I was supposed to meet someone there." The man studied her for another moment, his gaze moving from her face to her belly and back again. Then he dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled a blanket from behind his saddle. He draped it over her shoulders without asking, and the wool still held the warmth of the horse. "Can't make Silver Creek before dark," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Storm's coming in." Caroline pulled the blanket tighter. "I don't have anywhere else to go." He nodded once, as if that settled something, and held out his hand. "Name's Jacob Marlow, got a place about 2 miles south. You can wait out the weather there." She hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand. Every instinct told her not to trust a strange man in the middle of nowhere, but the alternative was freezing to death in a snowbank. She took his hand, and he pulled her up behind him on the horse with surprising gentleness. The ride took longer than 2 miles should have. The wind howled around them, and snow came down so thick Caroline couldn't see past Jacob's shoulders. She wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The baby kicked once, a flutter like bird wings, and she found herself praying to a god she wasn't sure listened anymore. Jacob's place turned out to be a cabin tucked into a stand of pines, with a barn about 30 yards off and smoke rising from a stone chimney. He helped her down and led the horse toward the barn, gesturing for her to go inside. Caroline pushed open the door and nearly cried at the blast of warm air that hit her. The cabin was small but clean, with an iron stove burning in the corner and shelves lined with canned goods and folded blankets. A narrow bed stood against one wall, and a table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Everything looked handmade, the kind of careful work that spoke of long winters and steady hands. Jacob came in a few minutes later, stamping snow off his boots. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, adding wood to the stove and filling a kettle from a bucket by the door. Caroline sat at the table, still wrapped in his blanket, and watched him. He didn't look at her, didn't ask questions, just made coffee and set a cup in front of her before taking the other chair. "Thank you," Caroline said. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and she wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'll leave as soon as the storm clears." Jacob nodded. He had his own cup, but he didn't drink from it, just held it like he needed something to do with his hands. Garrett's place is in Silver Creek. He runs cattle with his brother. They got a big spread near the river. Caroline felt her throat tighten. "You know him?" "Know of him." Jacob's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his voice. "Heard he was bringing in a wife from back east." "That was supposed to be me." Caroline stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise. But he changed his mind when he found out about the baby. Or maybe he changed his mind for some other reason. The driver wouldn't say. "Driver shouldn't have left you on the road." He was scared. I could see it in his face, like someone had threatened him. She looked up at Jacob, studying his weathered face and the way he held himself so carefully still. "Do you know why Garrett would do that?" Jacob was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls and snow hissed against the windows. Finally, he said, "Men like Garrett don't always think straight when it comes to reputation. Silver Creek's a small town. Folks talk." "I told him the truth in my letters. I didn't lie about anything." "Didn't say you did." Jacob stood and moved to the stove, refilling his cup even though he hadn't touched the first one. But knowing something in a letter and seeing it walk off a wagon are different things. Especially with his brother breathing down his neck about family name and proper behavior. Caroline felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp. "So he just abandons me in the snow, lets me freeze rather than face a little gossip." "Like I said, men don't always think straight." Jacob turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like sympathy. "You got people back east, someone you can send word to?" "No," the word came out flat. "My aunt's dead, my husband's dead, there's no one." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Jacob set his cup down and crossed his arms, his gaze steady on her face. "Storm'll probably blow through by morning. I can take you into Silver Creek then, help you figure out what to do. There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen. She's fair-minded, might have work for you." "I don't want charity." Caroline lifted her chin, even though her eyes were burning with tears she refused to shed. "I can work. I'm strong, and I'm not afraid of hard jobs." "Didn't say you were." Jacob picked up her empty cup and moved to the stove again. "But you're also carrying a child, and you just about froze to death. You need rest before you need work." He was right, and Caroline hated that he was right. She felt the exhaustion pulling at her, making her bones feel like lead. Jacob nodded toward the bed. "You sleep there tonight. I'll take the floor." "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "I've slept in worse places than a warm floor." Caroline wanted to protest more, but her body betrayed her. She moved to the bed and lay down fully clothed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The mattress was stuffed with straw and it crackled when she moved, but it was soft enough, and the warmth from the stove reached all the way to the corner. She closed her eyes and listened to Jacob moving around the cabin, the soft sounds of him banking the fire and spreading blankets on the floor. "Mr. Marlow," she said into the darkness. "Jacob's fine. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Maybe I know what it's like to be left out in the cold." Caroline wanted to ask what he meant, but sleep was already pulling her under, and the last thing she heard was the wind howling outside and the crackle of the fire burning low. She woke to grey dawn light and the smell of frying bacon. Jacob stood at the stove with his back to her, working a cast-iron skillet with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Caroline sat up slowly, her back aching and her mouth dry. "Storm passed," Jacob said without turning around. "Snow's deep but the sky's clear. We can make Silver Creek by noon if we leave soon." "All right." Caroline swung her legs off the bed and stood, steadying herself against the wall. She felt stronger than she had the night before, but there was a new kind of fear settling in her chest. What would she do in Silver Creek? Where would she go? Jacob dished up eggs and bacon onto 2 tin plates and set them on the table. They ate in silence, and Caroline found herself stealing glances at him. He had deep lines around his eyes and mouth, the kind that came from squinting into sun and wind for years. His hands were scarred and calloused, and he ate like someone who'd learned not to waste time on meals. "You've been alone here long?" she asked. "Few years. No wife, no family." Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Had a wife once. She died in childbirth, the baby too." Caroline set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "I'm sorry." "Was a long time ago." He stood and carried his plate to the wash basin, his movements clipped. "We should get moving." They rode double again, Caroline holding on to Jacob's waist as the horse picked its way through snowdrifts that came up to its chest in places. The sun was bright on the white landscape, almost blinding, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. They didn't talk, but Caroline found herself grateful for the warmth of Jacob's back and the steady presence of him. Silver Creek appeared around midday, a collection of wooden buildings huddled along a frozen creek. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and Caroline could see people moving on the main street, bundled against the cold. Jacob guided the horse to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign that read Chen's boarding house. He helped her down and retrieved her bag from where he'd tied it behind the saddle. "Mrs. Chen's good people, tell her I sent you. You're not coming in. Got business elsewhere." Jacob handed her the bag, and for a moment their hands touched. His fingers were rough and warm, and Caroline felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to hold on. "Thank you," she said, meaning it with everything she had, "for saving my life." Jacob looked at her with those pale eyes, and something passed between them that Caroline couldn't name. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned the horse away, riding back the way they'd come. Mrs. Chen was a small, round woman with iron-grey hair and sharp black eyes that seemed to see everything. She listened to Caroline's story without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and then nodded once. "Room's $2 a week. Meals included if you help with the cooking and washing. I don't tolerate drinking or men visitors after dark." "That's more than fair," Caroline said. Relief made her dizzy. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Silver Creek's not kind to women in your situation. You'll earn every penny." Mrs. Chen studied her with something that might have been sympathy. "But you work hard and keep your head down, you'll be all right." Caroline spent the next week scrubbing floors and washing sheets, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water. The other boarders were miners and ranch hands who tracked in mud and snow and ate like they were afraid someone would steal their plates. Mrs. Chen ran a tight operation, and Caroline found comfort in the routine, in having something to do with her hands and her mind. But she thought about Jacob constantly. She'd see a man in a patched coat across the street and her heart would jump, only to sink when she realized it wasn't him. She told herself she was being foolish, that he'd done his Christian duty and moved on with his life. But at night, lying in the narrow bed in her tiny room, she'd remember the warmth of his back and the careful way he draped that blanket over her shoulders. On the 8th day, she was hanging wash in the backyard when she heard Mrs. Chen call her name. Caroline wiped her hands on her apron and went inside to find Jacob standing in the front hall, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Marlow," she said, and hated how breathless she sounded. "Ma'am," he nodded to Mrs. Chen. "Could I speak with Miss?" He paused, and Caroline realized she'd never told him her last name. "Monroe," she said, "Caroline Monroe." "Miss Monroe, if that's all right." Mrs. Chen looked between them with knowing eyes. "Parlor's empty. You got 15 minutes before I need it for the pastor's wife." They sat on opposite ends of a worn settee, and Jacob turned his hat around in his hands like he didn't know what to do with it. "Been thinking about your situation," he said finally, "about what you're going to do when the baby comes." Caroline felt her spine stiffen. "I'll manage." "Didn't say you wouldn't." He set the hat on his knee and looked at her directly. "But Mrs. Chen can't keep you on once you can't work, and there's no doctor in Silver Creek. Nearest one's in Helena, 3 days' ride in good weather." "I know all that." "Then you know you need a plan." Jacob took a breath, and Caroline saw his hands tighten on the hat brim. "I got a proposition. It's not romantic and it's not particularly kind, but it's practical." Caroline's heart was hammering. What kind of proposition? "Marry me, come back to the cabin. I'll see you through the birth and help you raise the child. In return, you keep house and help with the place. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." The words hung between them like smoke. Caroline stared at him, trying to understand what he was really offering. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've got room and you need it. Because that cabin's too quiet for one person." Jacob's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "And because no woman should have to face what you're facing alone." "You don't love me," Caroline said. It wasn't a question. "No," Jacob agreed. "And you don't love me, but maybe that's better. Love makes people stupid. This way we both know where we stand." Caroline thought about the boarding house, about the whispers that followed her in town, and the way men looked at her belly like it was proof of sin. She thought about winter coming on and the baby growing inside her, about what would happen when she couldn't work anymore. And she thought about Jacob's cabin, warm and quiet, and the careful way he'd cared for her when he had no reason to. "A business arrangement," she said slowly. "That's all." "That's all. And if I agree, you won't." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. "I won't touch you," he said firmly. "You'll have your own space, your own life. I'm offering partnership, not ownership." Caroline closed her eyes. Every practical bone in her body was screaming at her to say yes, but something else held her back, some part of her that still believed in love and romance and happy endings. She opened her eyes and found Jacob watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I need time to think." "Take all you need." Jacob stood, settling his hat on his head. "But think fast. Winter doesn't wait for anyone." He left, and Caroline sat alone in the parlor, her hands pressed against her belly. The baby kicked, stronger now, and she felt tears slide down her cheeks. This wasn't how her life was supposed to go. She was supposed to marry for love, raise her children in a real home with a husband who cherished her. But life had never cared much about what she was supposed to have. She found Jacob 2 days later, working on a fence near the edge of town. He looked up when she approached, his face carefully neutral. "Yes," Caroline said before she could change her mind. "I'll marry you." They were wed the next morning in the Presbyterian church, with Mrs. Chen and the minister's wife as witnesses. Caroline wore the same blue dress she'd arrived in, and Jacob wore a clean shirt that still smelled of lye soap. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes, and when the minister told Jacob he could kiss his bride, Jacob just nodded politely and stepped back. The ride to the cabin was quiet. Caroline sat behind Jacob on the horse, her hands resting lightly on his waist, and watched the snow-covered landscape roll past. She felt numb, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. But when they reached the cabin and Jacob helped her down, something shifted. He carried her bag inside and showed her the corner he'd partitioned off with a curtain, giving her privacy. He'd built a new shelf for her things and laid out extra quilts on the bed. The stove was burning hot, and there was fresh bread cooling on the table. "It's not much," Jacob said, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to come all the way inside his own home. "But it's yours too now." Caroline looked around the cabin, her cabin now, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been hope. "It's more than I had yesterday." Jacob nodded, and for just a moment, the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then I guess we're both doing all right." The days fell into a rhythm. Caroline cooked and cleaned and mended Jacob's clothes while he worked the small herd of cattle he kept in the valley. They spoke little, moving around each other with careful politeness, but Caroline found herself watching him when he didn't know she was looking. The way he gentle broke a new horse, his voice low and patient. The way he always made sure the wood box was full before he came in for supper. The way he'd pause sometimes at the door, his hand on the frame, and just look at her like he was memorizing something important. Winter deepened, the baby grew heavier, and Caroline moved more slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back. Jacob started coming in earlier, doing the evening chores she couldn't manage anymore. He never complained, never made her feel like a burden, but Caroline felt it anyway. "You don't have to do all this," she said one evening, watching him haul water from the pump. "I can still." "You're carrying a child," Jacob interrupted, setting the bucket down with a thump. "Let me help." That's all I do anymore, take help." Caroline's voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face, ashamed of the tears. "I'm supposed to be useful, that was the arrangement." Jacob crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her hands away from her face. His grip was gentle but firm, and his eyes were fierce. "The arrangement was that you'd live here and help when you could. You're doing that. The rest is just life, Caroline. It happens whether we plan for it or not." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his rough voice made her breath catch. They stood there, hands linked, and Caroline felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm scared," she whispered, "of the birth, of what comes after." "I know." Jacob's thumb moved against her palm just once, and the gesture was so tender it made her want to weep. "But I'll be here. Whatever happens, you won't be alone." The baby came in late January, during a blizzard that howled around the cabin like a living thing. Caroline had known it was coming since morning, the dull ache in her back sharpening into waves of pain that took her breath away. Jacob rode for Mrs. Chen despite the weather, and the older woman arrived half frozen but determined. The birth was long and hard. Caroline screamed until her voice gave out, and Mrs. Chen barked orders at Jacob, who moved with quiet efficiency despite his pale face. Somewhere around midnight, when Caroline was sure she couldn't bear another minute, the baby finally came, a girl, small but fierce, with lungs like a bellows. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby and wrapped her in blankets while Jacob helped Caroline sit up, his arms solid around her shoulders. "A daughter," Mrs. Chen said, placing the bundle in Caroline's arms. "Strong, like her mother." Caroline looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart break open. The baby had dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus, her little mouth working like she had important things to say. "She's perfect," Caroline breathed. Jacob was standing a few feet away, his hands shoved in his pockets, but his eyes were fixed on the baby with an expression Caroline had never seen before, raw and hungry and heartbroken all at once. "You want to hold her?" Caroline asked softly. Jacob shook his head. "I'm all right here." But later, after Mrs. Chen had gone home and Caroline had fallen into exhausted sleep, she woke to find Jacob sitting in the rocking chair with the baby cradled against his chest. His eyes were closed, and he was rocking slowly, his big hand cupped around the baby's head. Caroline watched him through half-closed eyes and felt something settle into place inside her. They named the baby Grace, and she grew like a weed through the spring. Jacob made her a cradle that hung from the ceiling, and Caroline would wake in the night to find him standing over it, just watching. He never said what he was thinking, but Caroline could see it in the way he'd touch Grace's tiny hand or the way his face would soften when she smiled. "You're good with her," Caroline said one evening, watching him walk Grace around the cabin to soothe her crying. "She's easy to be good with." Jacob's voice was gruff, but there was something else underneath it. You'd have made a good father with your own children. Jacob's steps faltered, but only for a moment. Maybe, maybe not, doesn't matter now. But it did matter, Caroline realized. It mattered because somewhere along the way, this arrangement had stopped being just an arrangement. She'd fallen in love with Jacob Marlow, with his quiet strength and his careful hands and the way he looked at Grace like she'd hung the moon. And she thought, hoped, that maybe he felt something too, though he'd never say it. Summer came, and with it the hard work of the ranch. Caroline helped where she could, Grace strapped to her back in a sling Jacob had fashioned from spare cloth. They worked side by side, mending fences and tending the garden, and sometimes their hands would brush or their eyes would meet, and the air between them would feel electric. One evening in August, after Grace had been put down and the cabin was quiet, Jacob spoke from his place by the stove. "You ever regret it, agreeing to this?" Caroline looked up from the shirt she was mending. "No, do you?" "No," Jacob turned to face her, and his expression was open in a way she'd never seen. "I thought I would, thought I'd always see you as the woman I saved from freezing, but somewhere along the way you became—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Became what?" Caroline's heart was hammering. "Home," the word came out rough, almost angry. "You and Grace, you're home." Caroline set down her mending and crossed to him, and for once Jacob didn't step back. She took his scarred hands in hers and looked up into those pale eyes. "Then I guess we're both home," she said, "because I can't imagine being anywhere else." Jacob pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her for the first time since their wedding day. Caroline pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been lost had finally found exactly where they belonged.